touched on one thing in there, and as we're like kind of starting to get towards the end of our discussion and all that, I do want to make sure that we briefly give you the floor to talk a little bit about stigma,
Mm,
because we didn't really hit on it too much, but I know it's
sure.
an area that you focus on. And whether it's stigma of like, oh, I'm not good enough for grad school because like you have to be some brainiac or whatever, or the other types of social stigma that a lot of people face. Maybe could you just share a little bit of some of the research and things that you found in your work when it comes to stigma?
Yes, that's a great question. And I haven't done any work on stigma within the context of graduate school. Um, but I think there's a connection to our worth as a person. And that internalized, so some of the work, so I like, should I talk about my work or the thing that's most relevant to this conversation? Probably the latter. But the we tend to internalize messages from society in a way that, like, if there's a stigma towards seeking help, then I will feel stigma towards myself if I seek help. And that internal stigma, that really drives the bus of our behavior and what we do. Um, and so if to take that work and to translate it to, and so for example, with help seeking research, that self stigma, what we find is that the societal or perceptions of external stigma, the way that it influences behavior or intention to seek help is through its impact through cultivating that self stigma of seeking help. That's the major, the major piece. Um, and so, for a lot of people, so this is me, some conjecture and applying it to, let's say, a grad student context is, and even an earlier, way earlier part of our conversation is, if we have an identity, let's say, as being smart or being gifted, then we can be really uh, nervous about losing that. And I don't know what this stigma would be called, if there's a stigma of being average, maybe, or I see that fear a lot with people. Um, and to the point where, like, someone won't seek help, there'll be a fear of, actually, it really does play out, of asking for help, for example, in grad school, or doing something that's wrong, right? I remember working with a client who just wouldn't, he really didn't want to tell his advisor that he didn't know how to do this analysis, which was totally developmentally appropriate to not know how to do. But then instead he avoided it and had this problem where his advisor was thinking wasn't motivated or wasn't doing work, but he just wasn't asking for help because of some of those pieces of, like, what is that internalized stigma. But then we see, like, with gifted students, it's really interesting. And this is me, we're at the end, so I'm just tangenting all over the place. But
Bring it.
with, here we go. So I think this finding is kind of interesting. So on one IQ assessment, there's a measure of processing speed where you see an image, uh, you have like a pamphlet, and you see a little, like, a picture, and then, like, I think maybe like 4 or 5 other pictures, and then you're supposed to write a slash, like, when you see the same picture, and if you don't, then you write, then you slash the, like, there's a box, I think, that's indicates, like, it's just not here. And um and interestingly, a lot of gifted students will score lower because they're afraid of being wrong, when actually it's more like, and it's something where normally you don't actually finish by the time the timer is up. It's rare to get to the end. And it's not that gifted people are slower processors, but it's the way that that anxiety and that need to be right plays out in the test. And so I think when you get to grad school, you have all these people who have been told that they're the smartest in the class, and all of a sudden now you're with a bunch of people who are the smartest in the class. And I think there's some type of, maybe it's around, like, asking for help, or around something related to that identity around their intelligence that they've internalized, and doing something that flies in the face of that. So I'm not sure if it's quite stigma, but they might also be worried about experiencing stigma from their peers of, like, being average or not being perfect. But I'm also kind of thinking out loud here, but I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I kind of like think about the stigma thing too, and like, sometimes I think I have what I'll call it like a perceived stigma, like there's an expectation on me that really doesn't exist. I don't know if there's an actual
Yep.
name for that, but yeah, like, and sometimes it just is a matter of me like coming to terms with the fact that like, this is me like being negative in a way, this is not the self-kindness side, but like in a way to further validate is like, sometimes it's like, no one really cares if I mess up at this. You know what I mean? Like nobody really cares if I fail this test or if I don't get a piece of research published on my first try or whatever it is. And I think that that's like a big thing that like for me that has been a benefit is just like trying to figure out if there's really even a legitimate stigma around what I'm trying to do or that around something that's going on in my life, or if it's just something that I'm just like, if society like talks about it like it's this big like stigma or pressure to be on people, but in reality nobody cares.
Yeah.
So
100%.
yeah, so that's
Yeah.
been with the stigma piece. I think that's been something for me that's been big. Like, and I'll even turn it around back onto some of the work that I think you did say you do is like on people, the stigma around people looking for help. I don't know what it was, but around like there was from a fairly young age, I would say relatively, I don't know that it's young in the big picture, but like somewhere around like sophomore year of high school, I was just like, I don't really care if people think I'm done. I need, like, if I can't get something finished or like I need help on it, like I'm literally not going to understand if I don't ask. So even if somebody did think that I was stupid because I asked a question or whatever, like I have to ask. Like, even if there is a stigma around that, like I need help with stuff. Like there's the expectation that I would just know everything and have been exposed to everything in the world is silly. So
come on, Brennan.
Pick it up. Yeah. But yeah, like that's definitely one stigma that it was like an aha moment where I was like, why would I not ask for help? That just seems so wrong. So yeah, that's definitely my experience with the stigma piece.
Yeah, I love that. And from a clinical standpoint, I always found that supervisors when I was a grad student trusted me partially because I would ask. And
Yeah.
I know it's the people who never ask for help where I'm just like that then I get concerned that I feel like I have to watch because there's no way you can know everything. And it's funny where you were saying about the like no one cares. That's sometimes what I'll tell people when they get worried about like asking a professor for an extension actually is a good one. We're like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm like, you think you're that important to your professor, like in their life, like, do you think that and I realize that might sound like could come off the wrong way, but it's this idea of like, we're all mostly focused on ourselves, and a student getting an extension on a paper or like needing that is like, okay, that's fine. Like I am not like this idea of that this student could impact like my day at this large scale. To me, it's like I'll think about the fact that in 100 years, no one's going to know who I am.
Right.
I'll have
Yeah.
right. So like, why am I living? And I say
dust
this
in the wind.
yeah, so I or like stigma around leaving academia people talk about. Like, who actually really cares? Like, even if there's someone you judge for something, do you go home and sit at the dinner table and think about what that person did? Like, no, and they're not going to think about you either. And now I say this, but in practice, I am still working on, moving through those pieces. But it's like one of the most like, not relaxing, but like helping me let go is just reminding myself of like my own lack of importance to other people, but in a way that's empowering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and that's like, just to bring it back to the book Meditations, like the Stoic philosophy stuff, like that's what I love about it is like, it's a kind of the balance, right? It's such a harsh statement that is such a freeing statement.
Yes.
And it's holding both, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that.
Yeah, this is really cool just to hear about like the process of stigma, because of course the word gets thrown around all the time, but I don't think
there's a stigma around the word stigma. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, there is, because I don't think that we go as much to say that like the reason it exists is because we internalize what like the response is or what happens. And yeah, it's so challenging and can be so tough because it's so easy to think that like we need to present so well, especially like you're saying in a graduate program, like you need to be this smart person because people are holding you to this high standard when in reality nobody knows what they're doing most of the time.
No.
Right? Like everybody's an imposter, and that's fine. And that balance is hard, but yeah, it's so true that like you don't know something, you have to ask a question. And of course, like I'm still trying to practice that myself. I think I need to start asking Brennan, like, what's the trick more so?
There may be no more truer purpose to even going into grad school in the first place than to ask a ton of questions. Right?
Right.
Like, why else are you there?
That's such a great point. I mean, especially like if you're doing research, like that research is asking and answering
Yes.
questions. Like that's why I always love my advisor would be like, if you knew everything already, I'd be out of a job. Like, what would be my purpose? Like literally, I'm like, oh yeah, cool.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, well here, I don't know this and I don't know this.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and I think with that piece of like, Nick, we said of like, what is stigma? Like, I forget that we don't really talk about that part. And it's important to name like, and there are different definitions out there, but you know, stigma is pretty much when people don't align with values driven expectations, and they're often arbitrary, and you know, and we see them change over time, right? Like how it was okay in a lot of mainstream ways to be homophobic like 10 years ago, and now, you know, mainstream wise it's like it's not, and just like the ways that, yeah, like so it's really like cultural norms intersecting with values, those expectations, which then we internalize and apply to ourselves, and in ways that are detrimental. And it's that balance of like not wanting to be completely rejected, but also needing to live our own lives. And kind of like we were saying, like in a lot of these cases, especially the pieces that we've internalized, like we're often not going to be rejected. Now there are things with like sexual orientation where, yeah, people do run risks. And even though the world is better now than it was before, there are also people whose families or where they live, you know, in rural America where it's not safe. And I think that's kind of the sad reality in certain places, and that dance you play of like, where does it align with reality and where doesn't it, especially when we get these messages on this like much larger scale because of how media, you know, can reach far places. But, you know, as long as we continue to have these conversations and dismantle them, we can hopefully decrease the extent to which they impact and inhibit, you know, us being our best, most authentic selves, I guess.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, it is pretty crazy to think just about how detrimental it can be when it is really socially accepted, when there's something that's toxic.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it's like I tell my clients often, especially the like when I work with folks struggling with their sexuality or their gender identity, or maybe they're not even struggling with it, but the people around them are. It's like, you know, you and I never should have met, right? Like this is not your problem. This is everyone around you being utterly ridiculous, and you know, I'm here to help you cope with that. And I'm happy to have met you because you're a beautiful soul. And this is really the dumbest thing that we're sitting in a room together, because if anything, it's the other people that I should be meeting with, and helping them get over their judgment, you know. And so yeah, it's really
I just you saying that, I heard a quote today that was like, if you were the only person on the planet, you'd probably be ridiculously happy, because like there like you wouldn't have anybody's problems like weighing down on you. Like you would just, and you wouldn't know anything else. So like your natural state would just be like to be happy with the situation you're in. And like just like exactly what you're saying, like these are other people's problems that are being, you know, infiltrating everybody's lives. And I think that that's like a empowering way to think about it for people, is like, yeah, like this, there's nothing wrong with me. Like this isn't an issue. This is just other people in these cases where it's like they're, you know, bringing their, you know, biases into my life, but that doesn't mean it's my problem.
Exactly. That's why like I love clinically working with university students as well. And this is my non-research part of my life, because that's a stage where, you know, they've left the nest and are discovering like who they really are and what really matters to them, and taking the positive things from their past with them, and also realizing, oh, wait a minute, some of those forces that have been holding me back from being who I am, I can let go of those. And so it's so exciting to just like kind of be along for the ride as people discover themselves and give them permission to, you know, discover and be themselves.